I'm just going to tell a gig story from years ago. Years ago, I got very deeply interested in the blues. And I've started a few blues bands over the years, but the one I started with, a singer named Julie, was successful right off the bat. The local college radio station picked up on us and played some of our homemade tapes, and wherever we played, the place would be packed and with a listening audience. And she was a very good, authentic blues singer. And we didn't work together then for a few years, and she called me for a gig at a Chicago suburban casino. And I called my favorite drummer, Charles, who has since passed away. But he was a great drummer, and he could play jazz, and he fit right in with playing the blues material we did. It was a good gig, and it paid good. And she had a few quirks. For instance, she would quit the gig 10 or 15 minutes early, and she says, well, by the time I walked out to my car and start my car, it'll be quitting time. Well, that was her rationale. And sometimes Charles and I would just play till the end because we wanted to keep the gig. It was a good gig. Occasionally, she wouldn't show up for the gig. So Charles and I would play the gig ourselves. And then at the end of this one particular week that I remember, I was talking to her on the phone, and I said, well, we'll figure out how to distribute the money since you didn't sing that one night, and we'll just split it that night between me and Charles. Well, she just got furious and very angry, to the point where she said, well, I've just bought a gun and I'll use it, MF. And this kind of shocked me, and I was a little bit upset. I sensed that she could be a tough cookie. So I called Charles and I said, look, I think there's going to be something happening at the gig tonight. You'll help me if you can show up early with me and at least give me some reinforcement. So I showed up to the gig an hour and a half early, and Charles was already there. And about 5 minutes after we sat there waiting, the singer Julie walked in, and she had a very stern look on her face. And we got into it. We had a shouting match right there near the stage. There weren't too many people around, fortunately. And I was wondering if I was going to get shot, but it didn't happen. And so we kept playing the gig, and if ever, it happened, I think, more than once, where she wouldn't show up for the gig. Charles and I would play the gig, and I just said, okay, fine. We'll just keep the money split the same as if she had shown up for the gig. And I don't think I brought that incident up with the agent, because I knew the agent. I had a little bit of a relationship with the agent. And another thing that happened was she wrote a song. It was a blues song, and we ended up recording it in a studio. And the song needed a little bit of a bridge or an interlude. And I mentioned it to her. She goes, yeah, maybe it does. So I wrote sort of a bridge to the song that set off the song and gave a little bit of a contrast and a lift that it needed. And she liked it, and she used it in the song. And I said, well, I'll just ask for, a small percentage of the song, like 20% of the song, for adding my idea to the song. Well, she wouldn't have any of that. She became very angry again. I said, okay, no problem, whatever you want. When we did the recording session, she hired some sidemen who were kind of expensive. And when it came time for us to get paid at the gig the next time, we got our checks as usual. But Charles had a habit of saving up his checks, 3, 4, 5 checks at a time, and then cashing them all at once after several weeks, which is okay, except that Julie had a habit of calling up the bank to see what the balance was in her bank account and accepting that balance as the amount of money she had to spend. And she had spent pretty much all her money on this recording session. So when it came time for Charles to cash his checks, there were $1,500 worth of checks that he couldn't cash because the money wasn't in her account. So this ended up as another confrontation at the gig, and another fear that I might get shot, or me or Charles might get shot. But it turned out that the gig ended and Charles was out of the money that he was paid. And in the course of the gig, I would bring cash to the gig and I would have her sign the checks over to me, and then I would give Julie and Charles cash, and I would take the check after that incident happened. But that didn't solve Charles's problem. He was out $1,500. I didn't really have any money to help him. But the interesting thing that happened actually about 3 or 4 years later, after Julie had moved out of state, she sent a check in full to Charles with a long letter, and she also wrote a long letter to me hoping that we could get back together and perform again. And she was good enough that even Charles said, yeah, that I would think it would be a good idea to perform with her again. And then I thought about it. I did not push that idea at all, and never did see her again after that. But that's the story of the wild blues singer that I worked with. And we did make some good music, and I loved playing the blues. But that was one of the interesting side things that happened.